I call the Honourable Sir Roger Douglas.
Mr. Speaker, the National and Labor parties are the biggest obstacles to reform, modernisation and eventual success of New Zealand. This budget shows why. National, like Labor, have elevated means over ends, pragmatism over principle, posture over policy, cynicism over sincerity, and symbols over substance. National may have inherited the financial mess from Labor, but that's no excuse for not tackling its causes head on. When it comes to means over ends, we can all agree we want to see New Zealanders enjoying the best living standards possible. Only ACT, however, identifies and promotes means based on private enterprise, choice and competition that will deliver that end on a viable and lasting basis. National has unfortunately long since succumbed to bribery via increases in government expenditure as a means to that end, a means that is not viable and leads only to lasting debt. The end result of decades of bribery by both National and Labor governments is a level of government spending that is local and central that now represents over 40% of GDP. Best international estimates of the optimal level of government spending are in the region of 19 to 22% of GDP. Running at nearly double that level can only mean an economy hobbled by excessive taxation and bureaucracy and warped incentives. That is exactly what we have in this country at the moment. A government that makes no serious effort to change this when it has the opportunity is clearly a government that puts pragmatism before principle. It fails to do the right thing because it's simply too hard and runs the risk of upsetting vested interest groups and lobbyists. While ACT welcomes the opening up of certain SOEs to private ownership up to 49%, we are left wondering why National lacks the courage of its alleged private enterprise conviction.
Order. The member can't use those words. An aspersion on members of the House. Just ask you to withdraw that comment.
I will withdraw that comment. It lacks the conviction of its alleged private enterprise standing and wants to retain a majority interest in, for example, an airline and a television network, when such things are properly the purview of the private sector. Thank you. Cuba nationalised everything in sight in the 1960s, but eventually learned its lesson and is now busy privatising again. If they can, then surely we can. It's not just a question of money, Mr. Speaker, that so-called asset sales would bring into empty government coffers. It's that the governments have no business owning such things as television stations and etc. in the first place. In its obsession with not frightening the horses, this government tries to create the appearance of tackling the present crisis, when in fact it does as little as possible. This is where posture over policy comes in. National at one time pretended to be enthusiastic about New Zealand catching Australia by 2025. It even created a task force charged with telling us how we could do that. The task force was even chaired by one of the best economic brains in the country, ACT leader Dr. Don Brash. It made many excellent recommendations. What has the National Party done? Filed them in the rubbish bin. National's purported commitment to catching Australia by 2025, if ever, is now shown to be as hollow as Helen Clark's infamous commitment to returning New Zealand to the top half of the OECD by 2010. All posturing, no policy to back it up. Even in the posturing was eventually abandoned, has Mr Key abandoned any pretext of wanting to catch Australia by 2025? Let him tell us. But if the answer is yes, as this budget would indicate, where does that leave his claim to be ambitious for New Zealand? Mr Speaker, in its failure to tackle the looming crisis facing our nation, this budget is a symbol of national cynicism. National knows, for example, that in reinstating a youth minimum wage, at least 12,000 new jobs for young people would be created in short order. The budget could have signalled National's intention to do that. It did no such thing. Instead, it relied on the tired old Muldoonist tool of subsidisation. Its youth employment package, which creates fewer than half as many jobs at an enormous cost to the taxpayer. A further instance of this government not only spending too much money, but spending it unwisely. Mr Speaker, I mentioned at the outset the government's propensity for symbolism over substance. Is there a more eloquent example than National's continuation of Labor's big government approach to early childhood education? Ever greater wads of taxpayers' money have been thrown at the sector, with both parties touting it as illustrating their caring natures. In practice, what's to show for all this generosity with other people's money? A 300% increase in expenditure over 5 years has resulted in a 1% increase in participation. Symbolism over substance, and at what cost? Symbolism over substance, and at what cost? Mr Speaker, in 2009, the Russian Prime Minister, Mr Putin, in a speech in Switzerland, observed that, and I quote, "Any fourth-grade history student knows socialism has failed in every country at every time in history." End quote. As a surviving luminary from the collapsed Soviet Union, Mr Putin should know what he's talking about. It would seem our politicians have failed to heed the lesson that Mr Putin correctly says is obvious to any fourth-grade history student. Sadly, the budget confirms this is the case. Government assets over the last 10 years have more than doubled to 120% of GDP, or $223 billion. That's billions of dollars taken from the private sector that would have otherwise gone to the private sector and invested in assets which show very low return. As President Ronald Reagan once observed, in our present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. New Zealand government, Mr Speaker, is too big, too intrusive, and it spends too much. National budget did nothing meaningful to change this. It was, as my colleague Heather Roy said yesterday, or so accurately described it yesterday, a dire disappointment and an abject failure of nerve.
I call Jamie Lee Ross.